So, let's talk about political intermediaries. Political intermediaries are informal institutions, meaning they are not part of the official or constitutional structure of government in most cases. But instead, there are these informal ties between citizen and government. As we will see in liberal societies, these are absolutely central to having representative democracy, and they serve a very important role. And as I'm going to argue, political parties are the superior method of creating intermediaries that make for the most effective, responsive, accountable democratic government. So let's go on and look at them and see what you think. First, why do we need intermediaries? Very simple. Self-government, particularly when you're talking about countries in the modern period when you have these massive states, in the US, 320 million people, we can only have indirect rule through the election of representatives. These representatives themselves are intermediaries, but it's also a large republic that we're dealing with, and as a result, we need linkage institutions because as individuals, there's no way one person can control a government of hundreds of millions of people. Liberal societies also presume that the main goal of our life is to pursue our private motivations, whether they're interests or passions. We tend to focus on things like career and family, the accumulation of property, happiness. These are all things that individuals are expected to do while also governing. Well, again, if we spent all of our time governing, we wouldn't be pursuing happiness, as Thomas Jefferson called it. And so these intermediaries make it a little easier for us to govern while also focused on our private life. Most of us also don't have adequate time or interest or sometimes knowledge to do so. Then the final reason we need intermediaries is that we're rational creatures and we use basically shortcuts or summaries or easy ways to make decisions. We often call them cognitive shortcuts. They're much more efficient than, again, gathering all the information every time we have to make a political decision. So these intermediaries help us sort of cut through a lot of stuff. There are four basic types: elected officials, political parties, interest groups, and mass media. I'm going to mention elected officials. I'm not going to cover mass media other than this slide because they're so complex and I don't have time in a winter session course to do this, but they're an important intermediary. Elected officials, political parties, interest groups, and mass media are the four basic types of intermediaries. I'm going to be focusing primarily on political parties and interest groups. So let's look at political parties. Political parties really are absolutely central, and some people say they're absolutely necessary for any kind of representative democracy. The reason, of course, being that we elect people, then we let them be for anywhere from 2 to 6 years, and then we come back. Well, we need political parties to do the work on a day-to-day basis that we're not necessarily willing to do ourselves. They have a special role in liberal societies, again, because of us being private individuals, not public ones fundamentally, according to liberalism. We don't pay close attention to politics. And so by having political parties, we really don't need to pay attention to politics beyond our decisions about preference in voting at election time, and we can let government do what it wants, at least theoretically, without having to pay attention all the time. Again, as individuals, we look for cognitive shortcuts. Political party is a cognitive shortcut. We know what a Republican stands for. We know what a Democrat stands for. We know what a Social Democrat stands for. We know what a conservative stands for. And so instead of looking at sort of the individual candidate or the individual political official, political parties provide us with that shortcut that is actually pretty accurate and pretty close approximation to what will happen by selecting a member of that party. So there's a schematic summary of the ideological preferences that we tend to have. And so if you're a Republican, you have certain ideological preferences, and the Republican Party stands for those better than the Democratic Party. And so you need not think anymore when you go in and make your choice uh, who to vote for. Well, it's a Republican candidate. That Republican candidate is the one that's preferred by me. It also provides for clear choices. When you have political parties with different platforms, different policy proposals, and promises, it provides for a clear choice when we actually go and vote so that we can decide the direction of government, again, without having spent too much time. It also ensures accountability and responsiveness. We elected this past uh, presidential election year in 2016, Republican majorities in Congress and a Republican to the White House. And so the government is supposed to respond by passing policies consistent with the Republican positions. That ensures for responsiveness. In addition, in 2018, this year, there's an election where every member of the House of Representatives and about a third of the Senate goes up for re-election, and Republicans will be held accountable under this kind of approach for either the success or failure of the Republican government. So parties allow citizens to know who to reward and who to punish. In the U.S. and other presidential systems, they serve another function, and that is a bridge between the executive and legislative branches of government. In a parliamentary system, as you saw, the party controls both the legislative and the executive through the parliament. In the U.S. system, we have separately elected presidents, and we found out very early on, by the early 19th century, that presidents need allies in Congress, and political parties became that natural ally, and they provide presidents with the support needed to pass public policy, and they allow Congress the opportunity to have a role in the executive branch through political party. The main alternative to political parties is interest groups. Interest groups are very small in their focus. They're specialized. Their concern is on private interests, not the public good. Parties have to think about their notion of the public or common good. Interest groups do not. They only have to care about what helps them. Interest groups are massively biased in terms of why they're involved in politics. And about 90 to 95% of all interest group activity is based upon economic motives. How will the material gain or loss affect the members of that group? That tends to drive everything that interest groups do, and that's a natural thing. You're not going to join an interest group to try to help somebody not in that interest group. Unlike political parties, where you may join a political party, not agree with everybody, but agree to compromise as a way of getting lots of stuff done. Resources tend to dominate the interest group process. Whoever has the most money, the largest membership, the greatest connections, and the best lobbyists tend to dominate the process, meaning public policy, when interest groups are the intermediary, tend to be biased strongly toward those with what we call resources. The most important resource is not money, it's votes. But second, a close second, and increasingly important, is money, because money provides all sorts of things, both for the interest group and for elected members of office, who now sort of run on their own, which I'll talk about in a moment or two. Then finally, compromise is not the preferred path for interest groups. They tend to be more ideologically pure, less interested in compromise as a last resort to get something when they can't get everything. With interest groups as intermediaries, you have all these thousands of different groups focused on a very narrow range of policy, putting all their energy into getting their preferred outcome. And what you see is the overall policy picture is very fragmented. And that makes accountability through elections very challenging. So, for example, for those of you who might be Republican but care about clean air and water, the fact that interest groups have worked very hard to get the EPA to sort of ease up on some of its environmental regulations means that you would be faced with a choice in 2018 of voting for a Republican for the House or Senate, knowing that the Republican Party has actually loosened clean air and water standards. And the reason they did that is because business groups that are affected by stronger regulations have worked very hard to promote their narrow interest, even if the general interest of the people, even in the Republican Party, is compromised. That's the difference between interest groups and parties. Interest groups, they really don't care about the collective good, the common interest, the public interest. They care about their own specialized interest, and they work hard on that. And that tends to result in a very fragmented policy process where policies don't often conform to what the majority wants. What about individual politicians? Many of you love to think that you're smarter and wiser because you vote the candidate, not the party. As you may have picked up already, I think that's balderdash. It's not true, and I understand that we tend to think it's the person, not the party, that matters. But you're all wrong if you think that. And I say that tongue in cheek, but there's a certain seriousness. First, there's this myth in a liberal society that's hyper-liberal like the United States that it's the individual who matters, not so much the group. The reality is political parties determine how someone votes once they get elected, particularly at the national level, about 96 to 97% of the time. And so if you vote for a Democrat, you're going to be getting the Democratic side of virtually every vote. If you vote for a Republican, you're going to get the Republican side. So regardless of what someone says in the campaign, regardless of what you may think, I like this person, I don't like this person, the individual member who gets elected is really less relevant than most people think. It's their party that determines their vote. And that's why, even though he may not have been the most respectable character, voting for Roy Moore would have been a very rational thing for a Republican in Alabama to do. Legislative institutions tend to be fragmented and decentralized. And as a result, any individual member who goes into a legislature can't do everything and has no power or influence. And so they have to join up with other people. And so even if you vote for someone because you think they're independent-minded, they inevitably have to side with one side or the other. Another reason, this sort of myth that it's the individual that matters and they'll vote their constituency, not their party, is the increasingly heavy dependence on political party and their allied interest groups for election money. A lot of people run as candidates, not as a member of a party, but the reality is they can do that because they get a lot of money to run, and they get that money from the party or from interest groups that are referred to this candidate by the party. And so regardless of what someone tells you, they are heavily dependent on their own political party for their money. And of course, people who give money have this expectation that they're giving it to someone who's going to vote the way they want them to. So there really are very few real independents. In fact, right now, if you look at the U.S. Senate, there are two political independents by name, Bernie Sanders and Angus King. Sanders from Vermont, King is from Maine. The reality is they're both Democrats. They caucus with the Democrats, they get much of their support from the Democrats, and they are aligned with the Democrats. And Sanders even ran as a Democrat for president, almost upsetting Hillary Clinton. So there really are few real independents. So when we think about politicians as intermediaries, what we're really doing is pretending that it's the politicians that matter, not the party that they belong to or are closely connected to.